It's a pleasure to welcome Guy Chambers, who is the Managing Director of Finlay's, a large global tea and coffee supplier. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Julian. Great to be here.
Thanks. So, in your career, you've managed many large-scale change initiatives. Can you give us a few of the kind of key success factors in making those types of initiatives a success?
That's a huge subject, and it's a very, very tough one. It's quite difficult to kind of simplify it down into really easy kind of small chunks.
Yeah.
But I'd say there's three kind of main thoughts. One is about thinking big.
Yeah.
You know, when you're doing a change initiative, because it does take a lot of time, it does take a lot of resources. You need to be thinking on the large scales of how to do it.
Yeah.
But whilst thinking that, the second point is around starting small.
Yeah.
You know, you may have some huge change initiative, but change doesn't happen in a big way overnight. All change of any kind starts in a very small place, and that primary, the first starting place, the initial starting place, and how you put that team together, how do you prove sort of a vision of where that change could go, and how do you demonstrate that is really critical, and it takes disproportionate resources in the early stages.
Yeah.
So thinking big, starting small, and then the third point is about scaling fast, because clearly if you start small and stay small, you're not really changing much. And so joining those thoughts of the big and the small, and ensuring that there's a way to scale it up beyond that small to the larger piece, and that being part of the plan from the get-go, from the beginning.
And I know you talk quite a lot about this notion of ambidexterity, the idea that we should be trying to kind of get the right balance between running the day business and running the startup idea. I mean, you were particularly talking about the startup thing. How do you make sure that you don't kind of lose focus on the day business while you're doing all this?
That's an incredibly tough one. That's a constant challenge. I think there's part of the learning so far from personal experience is around dividing up time.
Yeah.
It's around dividing up time in the week or during the month to make sure there's partitioning for the small stuff, for the startup bit or the innovation bit. Yeah. That has to be locked into the schedule somehow. But then the rest of the days and the rest of the weeks are going to get taken up doing your main piece. Yeah. It's also about separating place and location. You know, physically, can you create a small physical place where this new stuff is happening? Right. And perhaps that may even be slightly separate to your existing businesses, so it doesn't get too confused too early. Yeah. Also, so that small sort of incubating thing has breathing space to grow and get to a more mature stage before the organization starts trying to crawl all over it. So it's trying to kind of cut up both time and place on that, but there's no perfect art.
and as a managing director, you are obviously encouraging this sort of entrepreneurship from within in your own company. How far can you go with that? How much space and time and freedom are you giving people to allow them to do this stuff? Because ultimately, if you take that too far, you're allowing people to fail, you're allowing them to get into crazy ideas which actually don't fit. How do you put the boundaries around this sort of behaviour?
That's also a very tough one, Julian. The approach we're taking at the moment there's a couple of strands to it. I mean, first of all, it's talking about how important it is for us to change. Yeah. Most businesses are successful because of what happened yesterday. Yeah. So how do we create the success for tomorrow? And at least opening up the bandwidth in people's minds, even senior management minds, to say, we need to be prepared to change. Yeah. Secondly, trying to bring some new folks into the organization who have a little bit of experience maybe in a related area, yeah, which can help that change process. Yeah. Trying to create time and space for them to operate, and do that sort of balancing act. But it's very difficult to turn into a concrete formula to say do it ABC. It's more of a kind of a cooking exercise where you're trying to mix ingredients together and making sure they're not overboiling or undercooking. Yeah.
Right, and obviously over many years of experience, you've got a sense of whether you're giving too much freedom, not enough freedom, when you're trying to kind of adapt as you go.
And time will tell, so come back and ask me that in 5 years' time.
So we've talked about particularly kind of coming up with new ideas, getting that initial proof of concept. But if you take it forward, sometimes you will have an initiative, a project, which you now know it kind of works. And your job is to sort of build commitment and buy-in across the organisation, essentially roll something out. Tell us a little bit about how you build that level of commitment and buy-in from the organization when you're rolling something new out?
So an experience I had quite a few years ago, which was in China actually. We're developing a new route to market model for selling a product, and we basically followed the approach I was mentioning earlier of creating a separate space, a separate location to go and test this stuff on. It was a bit like a kind of a play area away from the main business. When we'd created that and when we'd ironed out some of the basic problems for it and we were getting some early data that the model was working, we then documented it. We then brought people to go and see it. Right. We then actually did workshops where we'd go and teach people what it used to be like and what it was now like, and really to socialize the idea and socialize the evidence that we'd got. And more questions started coming up as well, more challenges for it, but at least there'd been enough of the track record, enough of the history that you weren't debating an idea, you were actually debating something which had been done, and you had 6 months of data to talk about. And once that had enough life, it was more concrete to go and take to other people and bring other people to that site to explain it. Another couple of things is actually some of the topics we were talking about in the lecture earlier about making things tangible. So, change process, ultimately you're talking about changing mindsets, but in order to change mindsets, the physical environment is very important, and the linguistic environment is very important. What are you calling something new is very critical. You're having to create a new language to describe certain things because it's going to be new by definition. And then, if possible, how do you turn it into something physical? Documents is one example of that, documenting something or creating a tangible product, even if it's an intangible thing which you're selling, but actually turn something into physical. And that it's almost a psychological anchor that you've actually created something new. And it's not just an idea floating around, it's actually there's some physicality to it.
And it's easier for people then to talk about it and get excited about it.
Yeah, there's a strange, I'm sure neuroscientists probably go and study this, but there's some kind of strange thing going on in the mind. If you've actually created something as a physical product, people take it more seriously. People give it more weight when they're talking about it than if it was just an idea knocking around. And
is there one piece of advice you can give us in terms of things to avoid when you're trying to introduce change in organization? Any tips on where we might go badly wrong?
That's a very tough one. I think the one kind of overriding thought is about listening and feedback loops, which is, and this can be different in different cultures and different personalities, but any kind of change process, is an ebb and flow. It's transmitting and receiving, transmitting and receiving. And if that receive mode, for any reason, is not attuned enough, and it gets more and more difficult the bigger the organization is, but if the receive mode is not attuned enough, then when the change process hits the inevitable slowdown or hits the inevitable wobble, then how do you come out of it? And because everything's going to have a wobble. Every change process doesn't just go like that. It'll go like this, and then it'll have a wobble, and it needs to learn how to resolve the next bit to do that. If it's sensitive enough to get the feedback loop, to be open, to be challenged, and build that stuff in, then it has a chance of going forward. But you occasionally see some change projects where people are saying, well, this is what we plan to do, we're going to stick with this, and even if the reality is pushing back against it.
Right. And so not being prepared to adapt, and not being smart or emotionally intelligent enough to actually hear the negative feedback and
hopefully
to respond.
No, that's a tough one though, and it can, you can go home at the end of the day sometimes, and there's been very strong feedback on it, but you need to have the perseverance and the resilience the next morning to say, okay, well that was good, what can we change? Right.
But it's a fine balance, isn't it? Because obviously entrepreneurs need tenacity and resilience, but they've also got to be smart enough to know actually when they need to adapt mid-course, right?
Yeah. It's all about adaptation at the end of the day.
Exactly. A last question. You talk about the need for schizophrenia to have people who are actually good at operating in these kind of two different worlds. What do you look for when you're trying to hire somebody in your team? What sort of qualities are you looking for?
That's a good question. I think the schizophrenic idea is about people having the mental agility to deal with both corporate structure and of the sort of exploit business model and the explore of doing new stuff. Now, I wouldn't say every single individual in the whole organization needs to have that skill set, because there's some areas that you don't really want to be exploring too much. You know, how do you do accounts receivable? You can do a little bit of exploration, but at the end of the day, the customer still needs to pay on time. But to some people in the organization, certain roles in the executive team, I believe, and I'm trying to sort of prove this, that having some folks who have that sort of bandwidth to handle both the structured and the unstructured, corporate and the entrepreneurial helps. And it helps support the CEO and helps support the change process. So the question is, maybe they exist in the organization and a lot of it's about personality, maybe they don't. If you have an opportunity to hire from outside, the one point that I try and look for is when you're going through the CV, sometimes you see a CV where in fact you've got corporate experience and then sometimes there's a gap. And sometimes maybe someone's even gone and done a business or they've tried to go and do a business and for one reason or another then it goes on to something else and that's what you end up digging into.
And for some people that's a negative, but for you that could actually be a positive if there's an interesting gap, right?
If it's on a CV, then I think it actually adds a lot of interest and a lot of colour, and then it's, quite often when interviewing people, that becomes half the interview. It's saying, talk through what actually was this, what were the dynamics, and you start picking up whether this person actually has these languages, this kind of structured, unstructured, the corporate and the entrepreneurial bit, and it'll come through doing an hour or so discussion that, okay, this person has got that experience. So it's not necessarily, and sometimes, you may have someone who's got all the corporate experience, they've got all the corporate bits, but you're thinking, actually, what have they done in the what have they done in the blank space? How have they shown that they can they create new stuff or do new opportunities? And you're not seeing it so much in a CV, which is sort of back-to-back straight promotions in the same company.
Guy Chambers, thank you so much for your fascinating insights.
Thank you, Julian.
Thanks.